Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. We are changing the Earth's climate in unprecedented and irreversible ways, risking widespread devastation, heat waves, floods and droughts. Today's report from the International Panel on Climate Change, a group of the world's leading scientists, warns climate change is happening now and it is unequivocally the result of human activity. The head of the UN has called it Code Red for humanity. It warns that temperatures are on course to rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels within the next 2 decades. Sea levels have risen 3 times more quickly compared to the previous century. But in a small message of hope, the report concludes it's not too late to stop the worst effects of climate change, provided governments around the world make deep and immediate cuts in carbon emissions. Here's our science editor, David Shukman.
As the world gets hotter, it's becoming more threatening. With terrifying scenes of mass escapes from Greek islands, burning amid heat waves. Just as devastating fires also hit California. And the new report from the UN Climate Panel says there will be much more of this to come.
With every additional amount of global warming.
This major study concludes that temperatures are rising and that it's beyond doubt that human activity is driving them up. And all the warnings so far have been ignored.
The world listened, but didn't hear. The world listened, but it didn't act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster.
People in every region of the world are now feeling the impacts of more violent weather, fueled by the gases that we release into the atmosphere.
There's an absolute fact that human influence is warming the climate. And that's a very stark reminder that it is our activities which are changing the climate and affecting these extreme weather events. And as the planet continues to warm, these consequences just get worse.
And the scientists are more certain of all this because they've got satellites spotting in minute detail how the planet is changing. And teams of researchers out in the toughest conditions, gathering data to help work out what's likely to come next. The big question is how much more the planet will heat up in the coming decades, so scientists explored different scenarios. In 2 of them, there are rapid and deep cuts in carbon emissions, and although the temperature does rise to potentially damaging levels, it's just about within the limits set by the international community. But in 2 other scenarios, which are actually much closer to where we're heading right now, the increases are much more dangerous. And in the most extreme, where emissions just keep growing, things become, well, catastrophic. But the message is that there is still time to act.
In one sentence, this report shows that human action have got us to where we are, but human action can also crucially decide how the future will look like. We are not doomed.
There is a lot we can all do, like this project in Cambridge, to fit shades to keep the sun off the windows.
This problem's only going to get worse with climate change. We're going to have, I fear, more and more heat waves, and they're going to be worse and worse. So that's why I think it makes sense to shade your windows now, start learning how to adapt.
But some changes will be far tougher to deal with. The oceans will keep rising. We just don't know how much. The scientists are warning that there's going to be some rise in sea level, really whatever we do. Maybe 0.5 metre by the end of the century if emissions are brought under control, or 1 metre if they aren't, and that would be really devastating for millions of people on coastlines around the world. But they can't rule out a far bigger rise, approaching 2 metres, if the polar ice sheets collapse. The great ice sheets are already adding to the level of the sea, but this process may suddenly accelerate. Scientists aren't sure, but the implications would be disastrous. India is now in the grip of flooding. Higher seas would make it worse. The science has never been so clear that we can head off the worst of climate change, but not all of it. So we urgently need to get ready. David Shukman, BBC News.
As we've heard, the effects of climate change are already being felt around the world. After its most severe heat wave in 30 years, Greece is continuing to battle raging wildfires on the country's second largest island, Evia. More than 600 firefighters, some of them from the UK, are trying to control blazing forests which have destroyed homes and businesses. More than 2,000 people have been evacuated from Evia, from where our Europe correspondent Bethany Bell reports.
Fires rage on in Evia. It's been a week and they're still not under control here. Greece is experiencing its worst heat wave in decades. The searing temperatures and scorching winds mean these forests are like a tinderbox. The flames leave behind a ghostly landscape, white with ash.
The fire swept through these hills, killing the trees. And this is what has been left behind, wreckage and destruction. The ashes are still smouldering. The ground beneath my feet is hot from the blaze.
Vangelis has come to check up on his family's farm. It belongs to his son-in-law, who's off fighting the fires. Their flock of 2,000 sheep and goats used to graze on this hillside. Now, all lost in this disaster. He says he's never experienced a fire like this before.
Climate change, in my opinion, is hurting the entire planet, and especially these forests, which are flammable. The authorities certainly haven't handled this very well, but the fire was our destiny. No one could have put it out.
Dozens of wildfires have broken out across Greece in recent days. The Prime Minister says climate change is to blame.
We have an obligation to shield the country from climate change. I'm not looking for excuses. We have made important strides in organising the country, but that's not enough when you are faced with a phenomenon of such magnitude.
In some areas of Evia, the fires only stopped when they reached the sea. Many locals say they've been abandoned. They say the authorities haven't done enough to protect the forests and their homes. And with temperatures rising, there are fears of more wildfires like this in the years to come.
Should people be scared about what they read in this report and scared about what changes in their lives might have to happen?
They need to understand the consequences of us not collectively taking all the right actions. But ultimately, of course, many of these actions come down to governments. It comes down to businesses who are stepping forward and playing their part in terms of going to net zero. And of course, in each of our lives, we can take actions as well.
It's not just abroad that we're seeing more extreme weather more often. From Glasgow last week to London a few days before, we see it here too. One group of international companies is working together to try to drive down their emissions. Are you optimistic about the future?
Am I optimistic? I'm optimistic that we can take action and that there's a lot of will to do that. But I think a report like this shows you that this is about fighting as hard as we can to give ourselves the best chance. It's as good as it's been for as long as I can remember that people are wanting to take action on it. But I think we're a little bit away from saying that we can be optimistic.
The scale of what faces the government here is colossal. Not only banging heads together around the world ahead of this climate summit in a few months' time, but also making the case here that the costs and changes are worth it, especially as critics say that government ministers themselves are not doing enough. The hydrogen strategy we're still awaiting, the heating and building strategy still not with us, Treasury review during the spring still not with us, Number 10's net zero strategy expected later in the year. Wouldn't your job be easier if the rest of the government got on with what it was meant to be doing?
Well, I am confident that we will deliver on all of these commitments before COP26, and I'm throwing the kitchen sink at this, Chris, I can tell you, to make sure that.
Well, interestingly, they've all approved this document. I mean, the Saudis, the Russians, everybody, the big fossil fuel economies had the right to scrutinise the text before it was released and have endorsed it. But whether that translates into real action by any of them remains to be seen. I mean, we know that America under Joe Biden, the world's number 2 emitter, has said that they'll halve emissions by 2030. China, the world's biggest emitter, has said it'll be carbon neutral by 2060, but we just get a report that it's reopening old coal mines because there's demand for coal surging. I think the real test will come in November in Glasgow at the COP26 summit. You'll get the world leaders round the table and we'll really see if they're prepared to act on what is obviously very, very clear science, or whether they'll talk about acting and not really give any proper commitments.
And you've covered this subject for a long time, David, and you've read many previous reports, but this one is on an entirely different level.
It is. Over the last, nearly 20 years, effectively been a witness to the progress of science, because over that time, we've seen these reports go from being really cautious. You know, we think temperatures are rising, possibly there's a human factor involved, we're not entirely sure, gradually getting firmer until today, when those sort of caveats and qualifications just seem to have gone. I mean, the phrase "we're virtually certain" is littered through the report. The scientists are extremely confident. They've got enough data now. They understand how the climate system works, enough of it to be able to be categoric about the fact that, yes, temperatures have risen, yes, they'll go up further, and yes, human activity is involved. So it's a huge shift to have witnessed in that time.
David, thank you. And for details on how each of us can play our part and cut our contribution to carbon emissions, head to our website. That's bbc.co.uk/news.